My heart, I can't. My favorite character might be gone, and so much more. This is probably one of the best episodes we've gotten in Severance so far. Season 2, episode 4. You guys really loved the format of the last video where I focused on the most important details, the details you must have caught and the details you might have missed, and not doing a recap of the episode because we all watched the same episode. So that's what I'm going to do again. Let's get right into all the juiciest details of this episode. But before we do that, like this video so I can hit the algorithm, subscribe so you can get more of my uploads on all of these episodes and be notified when they go up. And lastly, before we get into the new details, to revisit some details from my last video. Number one, this is not a feeding tube. This is a breathing tube. I don't know what my brain was doing when I was recording, because in my mind, I was fully picturing like a breathing tube device, a device that helps people breathe. But I kept saying feeding tube, as well as in the email from the Lexington letter, it references things as a feeding tube. Now, feeding tube, breathing tube, any other hospital device, we know that Lumon makes all of them. So keep in mind that even though this slightly adjusts my theory and execution is still the same. That Mrs. Cobel's mother was a patient of a Lumon device at some point, and that Lumon is doing something on the testing floor that has more to do with patients who may be in comas or vegetative states and less to do with conquering full death at the current moment. However, I do believe that this is all in an attempt to conquer death and to conquer the human nature and the human condition of fragility and a short lifespan. Now, with all of that in context, it plays into some other things in this episode. And the second detail I wanted to revisit, that was a detail everyone missed in the last episode, and I need to reiterate now because in my comments, people still didn't understand. Husbandry tanks are for aquatic animals. Yes, husbandry, the term, can refer to any type of animal that is being put through a reproductive process, but you do not use husbandry tanks for anything other than aquatic animals. This is one Google search away, so argue with yourself in my comments if you want to. But yes, there are some aquatic animals for some reason on the severed floor. I want to add as well, do we all remember this weird detail from season 1 where Rickon was hanging seaweed during childbirth inside of the cabin? Something's going on there. I don't know what it is, but something is fishy. Now, the first detail we need to discuss is where the innies actually are. I've seen all the theories on whether or not they're on the testing floor, whether or not they're actually on a different floor inside of Lumon, and if they are even actually outside. Now, I believe that they might potentially be actually outside. I'm wrestling with it being one of two ways, but it all stems back to this detail because, like I've been telling you, everything we see in this show is very important. If you recall this article from season 1 that Mark the Audi was reading on his phone, it talks about how the coyote sightings at Gans College are starting to cause alarm. Not that coyote sightings are abnormal, but they have increased during the winter months, which indicates a greater loss of their habitat. Now, when I first read this, I thought, okay, we know that Lumon is expanding. We know that they've been expanding the Severance floor. They could be creating their whole own world underneath Lumon, right? But that could also mean that they're creating their whole own world in the real world around Lumon, correct? So it could go two different ways. So you guys tell me which side of it you think. This could either be they're expanding underground, which gives them the space to create what we're seeing happen in this episode, or they are expanding above ground, which means that they are truly outside, but they are outside within Lumon protected and Lumon watched territory. Now, a few key details I will tell you whether or not they're actually inside or outside, but either way, they are still on Lumon property is number one, how is the TV working? The TV would need to be plugged in, correct? Number two, how is Miss Wong's instrument working? Because the type of instrument she's playing called a theremin requires you to have it plugged in. On top of the fact, an interesting detail about a theremin specifically is that it is actually the version of a theremin that was recently created to be a modernized version of old technology. So it's just a cleaner, more advanced version of the same type of old technology of the original theremins that were being used. So to me, this might add more detail to what else we're seeing in the show when it comes to old technology in general. Yes, these computers are old, these phones are old, all the tech that they're using inside of Lumon appears to be old, but the actual tech inside might be far from the case. These are maybe modernized versions of old technology that just looks like and operates like an old technology, but has the computing power of something more modern. Now, a few other key details that let you know that wherever they are is a controlled Lumon created environment is number one, them waking up on the ice. Whether it's Irving or Mark S, you would not risk it. You would not risk losing your refiners and having to explain where they went. You specifically would not risk Mark S when you know he needs to finish the Cold Harbor file. So to me, it screams the ice is not real and potentially could be how they got all of the refiners into this space. However, we know that Helly herself wakes up on the cliff. So with that being said, let me know what you guys think. Is this Lumon controlled environment above ground or underground? Now let's talk about this outdoor retreat and team building occurrence, or the ORTBO. Now I've seen a lot of people talk about how if you rearrange these letters, it means robots. However, yes, I believe these uncanny valley twin versions of them that help along the way that has these weird, creepy ways of mimicking the way that they stand and the way that they move, although it's very uncanny and very not lifelike. I believe that those things particularly are robots. However, I don't believe that robots are the answer to Severance, not for a second. We know that Lumon has their hands in many different things that they're attempting to do, all within the sphere of technology and medicine. Robots would fall into that, and Lumon has their hands in many pies. But Gemma herself, that's not a robot. Whatever's going on with Gemma is the answer to the show, and Gemma herself is not one of these uncanny looking things we see walking around out here at this Dieter's place, right? So I believe that these robots are an entirely separate thing on their own, just like wherever they are, whether it's another floor inside of Lumon or it is more expansion outside of Lumon, is a part of what Lumon is doing, but this is not the testing floor either. This is all its own completely separate thing. Now, in reference to this Dieter Eagan National Forest, the fourth appendix, Woe's Hollow, and all of the above, I don't know about you guys, but throughout this entire episode, I was getting such hard flashbacks about the Deathly Hollows in Harry Potter. Now, as a reminder for those who may have watched it and forgotten, or those who have not watched it, the Deathly Hollows in Harry Potter were a story of three brothers who encountered the spirit of death, and each walked away with a gift from death that later on death came to reclaim them based off of these gifts. And the three of them put together creates the Deathly Hollows, because if you have all three, you conquer death. Now, that also sounds eerily similar to what we're watching in this show, which is a story about Kier Eagan, who conquered the four tempers, and these four tempers may be the key to becoming the perfect human, and Lumon itself is trying to code the four tempers out of human brains in order to potentially conquer death. Keep that all in mind. Not to mention, some of these shots are eerily similar and shot very similar as well. So if you've watched both, let me know what you guys think. Is it reminding you of that? Did you feel the same way on watching this? I think it's unintentional, but you guys let me know what you guys think. When it comes to, in our particular show, Severance, Hollow, Dieter Eagan, Kier Eagan, and the story of how Dieter Eagan passed, a lot of it is another clear example, like I've mentioned in previous videos, of the many examples throughout this show of how Lumon, Kier Eagan, and all of their backstory is very clearly trying to force this idea of religion and a lot of symbolism that is very similar to a religious cult. Now, these clear examples examples of them taking from various different religions and ideologies is very clear in this story of Dieter Eagan, starting with the fact that this fourth appendix that they must go find in a cave sounds a lot like the forbidden books and the lost books of the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in caves that contained a lot of different books in the Bible, was an original version of the Bible where some of the books and some of the texts found in the Dead Sea Scrolls are not included in a lot of modern interpretations of the Bible. Now let's talk about the fourth appendix and the story of Dieter Eagan. Starting with number 1, the fourth appendix seems to be the book that explains the origin of all the four tempers. It is also a book that he dictated on his deathbed, so keep that in mind. So to me, this could say a lot about what really happened to Dieter Eagan. Dieter Eagan is actually a real person in my opinion. I just don't believe that this is truly what actually happened to him. There is a sign on a bar that says Dieter's brother. So Dieter Eagan is a real person according to the Severance lore. However, he might not have died in this particular way. Now, when we get into the actual story, we find out that Kier was born with a twin brother who they were raised to be together as friends. And one day Dieter decided he wanted to go live in the woods as paupers. So Dieter and Kier go to Woe's Hollow. This is where they live out there for an unspoken amount of time. And every night at a particular moment, Dieter would go into the forest and self-pleasure himself. Now, there is a weird poetic description that goes along with all of this that really kind of threw me off, and I'm not going to get too far into the details, but we find out later on that at a certain point, Kier says that we need to go back to father. It's time to go home, because Kier thought that this was just some temporary experiment, them just doing these things for fun. Well, Dieter actually believed that they were going to live out in the forest forever. Now, I have to talk about how this is commentary on a brother who wants to live in the forest, responsibility free, doing as they please, going against the social norms, living outside of society, maybe even wanting to be opposed to technology, all things that are the opposite of where Lumon currently stands and exists. Where Kier, on the other hand, seems to be the one who followed the rules, which is how he created Lumon. Now, with that in mind, I believe that the story of Dieter all of a sudden combusting in front of him and turning into nature simply is not true. I believe that there is potential that Kier actually killed Dieter, killed his own brother, and that can maybe even make it more related to the story of something like Cain and Abel, for example. So keep that in mind. I believe that there's more to the story about what actually happened to Dieter, if Dieter died, if Dieter was murdered, or if Dieter even is still alive. There's a lot of different ways that this could go, but Dieter is in fact a true character, and Dieter Eagan truly did exist at one point. And to expand on this even more, this entire concept goes even further into duality. Something I've mentioned in previous videos is core to what we're watching in Severance, whether that is the duality of literally being a severed person, this duality of twin brothers who might have been even identical twin brothers who had completely opposite understandings of who they were and what they wanted to be, understandings of what it meant to do right and wrong, and making opposite choices of one another. The same duality playing out in this story. The duality of, for example, Persephone and how her story reflects both in Helly and Gemma, and later on in this episode we see that same thing play out, where this duality of Gemma and Helly is playing out inside of Mark's mind, something that was foreshadowed in the intro scenes of the show. Which brings me directly into my next detail, which is Helena. Now, we knew that this was not Helly the entire time from season 1. A lot of us picked up on this in the first episode. Small details like the elevator not dinging for her switch when she goes down the elevator, her being the first to notice that the security cameras are gone because, as we know, Helena watches them through the security footage. Then her not being able to turn on the computer in MDR, the weird way she asked completely completely different. I pointed out that Helena has a signature stare she does at people that Helly was not doing. And that was something that kept popping up throughout this season, as well as the fact that the Helena we know who is super funny, sarcastic, but at the end of the day, just as childish as the other MDR members, and was starting to actually build a family and a trust with the other MDR members. This Helena we've been seeing throughout the entire show was not that. She was not sarcastic at the right times. Her connection with them seemed off. Her understanding of how they interacted with each other did not sit right. And it really played out in this episode, in my opinion, because as someone who maybe isn't familiar with how the innies operate, going in there to go hear this story of Kier and Dieter Eagan, she may have thought that the childish response to this would be to laugh. But as we know, the innie's childish response is to actually be amused, to actually wonder and ponder if this stuff is real, because you don't actually have a full grasp and understanding on what concepts like self-pleasuring and things like that really are, what death really looks like, right? So that was something that was explicitly stated even in this episode when they all come across the seal and they're all like, is this what death looks like? So again, this was like the underlying detail to catch under that satire, was that it's not just us thinking it's Helena because Helly wouldn't laugh, but it's us knowing it's Helena because this was not the proper response of an actual innie. And these are all details that Irving caught on to very early on, even super early on in this episode, if you pay attention, where he's looking over his shoulder to look at Helly at multiple different points. Even when Helly first shows up and he's like, where did you come from? These are all signs that Irving, from even the beginning of this episode, was cautious about Helena to begin with. Whole weird interaction where Irving decides to ask her straight up, what did you see at the OTC? And Helly gives him this look. This look to me gave me a feeling in my chest. I was like, ooh, that is an evil look. That is an evil look. And that is not the type of reaction anybody would have, even if it was Helly, and even if Helly was lying about the OTC. That's not how you do it. This underlining thing of Helena, where when she's challenged on anything, her power play shows up. And it's because she's so used to being able to use her power. So the way that she says Irving and looks at him was her trying to assert power that Helly, the innie, would not have over Irving. So that's why it did not make sense. Same thing happens at the fire, where Irving and Helly, quote unquote, get into it, and all of a sudden Helena comes out inserting her power and her knowledge of their situation. Again, very cruel in a way, which is not how Helly is. And that all plays into how Irving figures it out. But Mark is blinded by the fact that he's so into Helly, he can't even see that this isn't the Helly he knows. This is somebody else. So he goes right into what we all saw coming, which is that Helena and Mark end up being together. But he does not know that the person, at least now he knows, but he didn't know before, that the person who he crossed this line with wasn't even the innie he fell in love with. It was Helena. Now, this episode beautifully begins and ends with a clear shot of Irving going through his transformation process. Now, at the beginning of the episode, we hear Irving clearly say, we are to follow in the steps of the brothers. And that is exactly what plays out through the entirety of this episode. We see as they continue their journey, Irving is catching on to the fact that something is off about Helly, maybe similarly to what was going on between Kier and Dieter as they were traveling these same steps as well. Later on, we get all the way to the campground, where there it finally all hits ahead, where Irving and Helly finally fight, and Irving reveals to everyone, including Helly before this, that he does not believe Helly is who she says she is, that something is off. Similar to how maybe the situations between Kier and Dieter all hit ahead during the same moment in the same place, right? Then that night, light as Irving goes into the forest to get away from them to ponder his thoughts and understand how he's feeling, similar to how Kier walked away from his brother. We see Mark make the fatal decision to be physical with Helly. Then we see this beautiful shot of these two different moments happening at the same time, where one is depicted again in that red gamma light I've talked to you guys about before, and the other is in the blue light. Now, again, remember that these lights tell us a lot about what's happening in these scenes. Because remember, as we talked about, gamma waves, which are represented by the red light, can signify insight, peak experiences, and synchronization. What happens in this scene? They are having a peak experience of being physical with one another, gaining insights on one another, as well as the insight or the forbidden knowledge of what the forbidden fruit actually represents in the Bible, which is learning what sex actually is. Synchronization, which then we get the glitch in Mark's brain where he sees Gemma instead of Helly, which can represent maybe the fact that Mark himself at this current state has gone through the reintegration process and it hasn't quite clicked for him yet. Then we have the blue side of Irving, where he's in this transcendence and this restoration period where he goes away to find himself in the woods. But this also represents the deep sleep that he ends up in, which is where he has the vision, where he wakes up in his suit and sees the refiner's desk far away in the forest. As he approaches, you can hear the sounds of the moths that are attracted to the light on this screen. And on this screen, we see a new file that is named the Montauk file. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you would know that we broke down how every single file name we've ever seen in the show and how they are all most likely places. Now, Montauk is no different. However, it does open up something I mentioned in a previous breakdown, which is that one of the other places, and now including Montauk, can also be synonymous with conspiracy theories that relate to what's happening in the show. The Montauk Project, which is a conspiracy theory that talks about secret experiments that involve mind control, time travel, and other paranormal activities that were said to have happened around this area during the 20th century. And Montauk, being the name of the actual file we see in Irving's vision, is on purpose. Then we go on to see in the rest of Irving's vision that Bert appears to him across the table. Now, there's a lot of theories floating around that. Number one, Irving has been working at Lumon long before he ended up being at MDR on the severed floor, but he had actually been working at Lumon for 9 years according to his own LinkedIn profile, one of the profiles that the show released. So Irving has confirmed to have been working at Lumon for longer than he's been on MDR and on the severed floor. And the theory goes that him and Bert may have worked together prior to this, and that is how they know each other and potentially how they actually were in love prior as well. So all of this could be true, and that could be why Bert appears to him in this vision as an MDR worker. But who else appears to him as an MDR worker? Across from him in Helly's seat is the Temper Woe, the small bride that was described by Kier in his story. And as this Temper Woe sits in the seat pretending to type on this file in a very creepy way, we see that Bert then turns to his screen where the numbers turn into 1, 5, 4, and 7. Now, these numbers will definitely be important at some point later on, so keep these numbers in mind. I haven't figured out what they're connected to yet. And then the screen starts to shift into a bunch of letters that go on to start to spell out the word Eagan. And then you slowly start to see the features of what look like a face at first, an eye, but then you see Helly's face, and then he puts it all together that Helly is an Eagan and that Helly is her outie. And then that morning when Mark wakes up and they all realize that Helly is gone and so is Irving, that Irving never came back, that is when we see that Irving and Helly come across each other at Woe's Hollow. Irving runs back, and in a perfect poetic moment, they meet at the bottom of the water at Woe's Hollow, following the steps of the brothers. That is where Irving confronts her and says to her that last night what you said was cruel and Helly was never cruel. So who are you and who would have the power to send their outie to the severed floor? He puts it all together, and that's when he decides that the only way to get to the answers and to prove to everyone so that they believe him is to threaten her life. So he starts drowning Helly and threatens to kill her. That is when everyone else runs up on them. And as Irving is doing this, that is when he tells everyone both that she is an outie, that this is not Helly, that she's been an outie the entire time, that she is a mole, and that she's an Eagan. So there is no room for misinterpretation here. They know everything that they need to know. That is when Milchick says to turn off the Glasgow block. Now, in my last video, there were a couple people who were confused on if the severance chip procedure was so automatic from the way that they go down the elevator and at that service exit where they can walk out to the stairwell and it just turns on and off. How could they then control the severance chip to come down to the floor? Well, obviously Lumon would have all types of precautions and ways to work around everything that they have, and the overtime contingency is not where it stopped. I talked about in a previous video how when we saw them turn on the overtime contingency, we saw a list of a whole lot of other contingencies that they were able to do, and we speculated on what we thought that they might mean. Glasgow was one of these contingencies. Now, from that video, we discovered that the Glasgow Coma Scale is an assessment tool that is used to evaluate the level of consciousness after a brain injury. Again, a lot of things are starting to point out to the fact that majority of what is going on at Lumon has something to do with comas and less to do with death. Now, we know that the Glasgow block is somehow a way that they're turning off the severed chip even when you're on the severed floor so that your outie can be the person who is on the severed floor. So keep that in mind. Is this a way in which they are putting on a Glasgow block to block the state of unconsciousness from the outie so that the outie is the one that's in control? Keep that in mind. And there's a whole list of contingencies in the way that they can control people who have a severed chip. So keep that in mind, as this will be important probably later on in this show and might hint at what they're actually trying to do with these severed chips. But at the end of the episode, as we all know, Helly turns back on. They all let go. Irving is apologizing because his plan was just to get them to turn Helly back. His plan was never to hurt anyone, but he knew what he had to do. And that is when Milchick has him stand up, and in a very crazy shot that reminds me of so many significant shots of when we lose some of our most favorite characters and they sacrifice themselves in some of our most favorite movies, and now this will be the new version of that. We see Irving walk into the forest as Milchick turns him off. Now, I'm praying to God that at some point, for some reason, we get Irving B back, but this could be the end for real of Irving B. But what I do want to say is that I don't think Lumon's prepared for the fact that Irving the outie is just as in tune with what's going on as well. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. What will come out of this? Who is he actually working with? And who is behind all of the things we've seen going on with Irving's outie? And what is really going on with the testing floor? And why do they want to get down there so bad? So keep all of that in mind. But that is the end of the episode. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know any details you may have caught that I did not talk about or may have missed. And I'll see you guys in the next episode.